Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the history of Catholicism in the United States, moving through the 20th century with the World War II, the Second World War. So I go into there's another playlist on this channel called Modern History, and it reflects the course, the third year course I have with the seminarians. So they've already had, and in that one, for the World War II video, I go into much more detail. But in this one, so if you're interested in that, in the details of the Second World War, more details, then go to that video. But for this one, I'm going to focus on the church and the church side of it in the United States. So on February 10th, 1939, Pope Pius XI died. He was followed by Eugenio Pacelli, who, as Pope 260, took the name Pius XII. He reigned from March 2nd, 1939, until his death on October 9th, 1958. Let's see, March. On September 1st, 1939, the European phase of the Second World War commenced when 1,250,000 German troops under the command of General Walther von Brauchitsch invaded Western Poland. Now, the immediate, as we covered in the Treaty of Versailles, the way the First World War ended and the treaty after that made the Second World War virtually inevitable. But the immediate causes for this. Earlier that year, from March 10th through March 16th, 1939, 6 months after he pledged at a conference held in Munich to not do this, Hitler broke that promise and annexed Bohemia and Moravia, which were provinces of, what is now the Czech Republic. They had a majority Slavic population, not German. No resistance was offered. But this action revealed to the Allies that another war with Germany was probably unavoidable. The following month, April 1st, 1939, the civil war, which had been raging in Spain, ended with a victory for the nationalists, the military, led by General Francisco Franco. The Royalists surrendered Burgos on March 25th, and the Republican, as they were calling themselves, but in that context that was the Communist, surrendered Madrid on March 28th. The death toll of the Spanish Civil War, which went on for 3 years, from 1936 to 1939, is estimated to have been between 600,000 and 1 million. Subsequently, Franco set up special tribunals to identify potentially disloyal elements, which resulted in another 100,000 executions. On May 3rd, 1939, Pope Pius XII offered to host an international conference to diffuse tensions in hopes of avoiding another war. Those tensions had escalated with each of Hitler's unopposed annexations, acquisitions of territory, which again in the videos in the Modern History playlist, I go into much more detail on that, and seminarians have already had this in the last course. The Pope was ignored, of course. On May 23rd, 1939, Hitler ordered his general staff to make preparations to invade and annex Poland, assuring them that the Allies would not fight for Poland after sacrificing the more industrially developed Czechoslovakia for the sake of peace. On August 23rd, 1939, Hitler and Stalin, so Hitler being the ruler of Germany, Stalin being the ruler of the Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact. And this shocked the world, since Hitler as a fascist and Stalin as a communist were at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. And Hitler had used the excuse of the Reichstag fire which he probably said himself, or had his stooges do it. He used that as an excuse to carry out wholesale slaughter, roundups and murders of German communists. Nevertheless, this showed that ideologies, when it's expedient, that can be ignored. This non-aggression pact had a secret clause which consisted of a new partition of Poland between Germany and Russia, as it had been previously partitioned in the 18th century and again in the 19th century, also covered in the Modern History playlist. On August 24th, 1939, Pope Pius delivered a radio address specifically begging world leaders to abstain from resort to another war, which inevitably would become another world war. Once again, he was ignored. At the end of the month, on August 31st, 1939, a group of German special forces, the SS, disguised themselves as Polish soldiers, and in that guise pretended to attack and seize a radio station in the town of Gleiwitz in Upper Silesia on the German side of the border. So they're staging, pretending that Poland had crossed the border to attack Germany. And then these German special forces, but still pretending to be Polish, began broadcasting from that allegedly captured radio station in Polish, in the Polish language, from the German radio station, calling for uprisings in Germany in support of an invasion of Germany by Poland. So Hitler used this as this contrived excuse as a pretext for his invading Poland. So he's announcing to the world, well, this is in self-defense. Poland attack first. I don't, nobody believed that, but he went through the charade anyway. And so that leads us to September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began because both Britain and France declared war, reluctantly, but still realizing that Hitler would not stop until forced to do so. Now, neither nation, neither England nor France, was in a position in September of 1939 to take any immediate action to save Poland. And they didn't have an extra million troops lying around who could just be sent to Poland within a week. Germany invaded Poland with 60 divisions, 1.2 million troops, supported by 1,600 planes. In keeping with the secret provisions of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east on September 17th. Now, Poland had an army of 800,000, but their equipment had not been sufficiently upgraded to wage an industrial war. And they were attacked from both sides, from the east and west, and with no substantive aid coming from any other country. Even those who had declared war on their behalf were not in a position to help them in the moment. The Poles did put up a tenacious resistance, but in the end they were forced to surrender, which took place on October 5th, 1939. And Poland was once again partitioned out of existence. The Poles suffered 250,000 casualties before they surrendered. Faithful to the Pius XII, like the popes during the Benedict XV during the First World War, maintained strict neutrality for the Holy See. The term he consistently used was impartial. On October 20th, 1939, Pius XII issued an encyclical named for the first two words in Latin, Summi Pontificatus. And it is referred to in the Catechism, the current Catechism. Catechism number 360 refers to it, refers to section number 3 of that encyclical in the teaching that on the unity of the human race as having a common origin because we were all created by God. We have unity of nature as human beings, created with a material body and an immortal soul. We have unity of our immediate end and mission in the world to live, to actualize all the potentialities that God gave us in accordance with seeking the good of God's will. And we have a unity of a supernatural end, an eternal destiny, a unity of redemption, that we were all, that Christ died for all of us. And the Catechism number 1939 refers to the to a lament in the encyclical, lamenting the disregard for this human solidarity, dictated and imposed by both our common origin and by the equality and the rational nature of all men, sealed by the sacrifice and the redemption of Christ on the altar of the cross, as Pius rephrased it, on behalf of sinful humanity. So that encyclical obviously was written in the time, reflecting the tragedy of the Second World War, but the teaching endures. As the Second World War stands out for there's just unbelievable casualties and what happened and things that were done in the war. But wars themselves have continued, even though, thankfully, so far they have not reached that scale. So the teaching remains of enduring value. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland with 1 million troops. And the Finns had a military of 300,000 troops, 80% of whom were reservists. And the Finns, like the Poles, put up a fierce resistance that proved to be an embarrassment to Stalin. Stalin executed a series of generals and then sent in more troops. So finally, Finland, like Poland, just overwhelmed by the numbers, surrendered. In the case of Finland, they surrendered on March 12, 1940, after suffering 600,000 casualties. The dismal performance of the Red Army in this operation would be a factor in persuading Hitler, or enabling him to persuade himself, that the invasion of Russia would quickly accomplish a conquest of the Soviet Union. In his Christmas radio address of 1939, Pope Pius XII outlined a set of principles which he offered to the world to guide the establishment of lasting peace, hopefully to end the war immediately and establish lasting peace. And this will, it was a radio address, so it was shorter, but the three significant elements of the address, which you will recognize from a previous video, and the 7 points of Pope Benedict XV trying to end the First World War. So Pius's initial 3 points were, first, disarmament, that was necessary. All sides have to disarm in order for there to be enduring peace. Second, all sides have to recognize the rights of ethnic minorities, the political, social, economic rights of ethnic minorities. And third, all sides have to recognize the right of every nation to independence, to its own sovereignty. So it is national self-determination, which we've covered on this playlist in much more detail in the modern history playlist since the 19th century. On January 26, 1940, in another radio address, Pope Pius XII denounced Nazi atrocities in Poland. So this whole thing that Pius is silenced, that doesn't have any basis in reality. I mean, he did denounce the Nazi atrocities more than once. On April 8th of the same year, 1940, Germany expanded. They launched simultaneous attacks against Denmark and Norway. So that's the countries on both ends of the entrance to the Baltic Sea, from the North Sea to the Baltic. Denmark fell the same day without firing a shot. Norway, on the other hand, mounted a resolute defense. Its regular army consisted of 12,000 troops plus another 120,000 reserves. This was the first campaign, the Nazi invasion of Norway, that employed the full panoply of modern war. The Nazis carried out a combined aerial bombardment and paratrooper landing to secure key Norwegian airports, and successfully held them. The paratroopers successfully held them until the regular infantry and armor arrived to reinforce and fortify those airports for Nazi use by the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force. The Norwegians were able to stall the Germans in the mountainous terrain long enough for the British and the French assembled sufficient troops to, attempt to assist. Well, not, I mean, they did assist, but so they, and the way they did, they tried an amphibious landing at Trondheim on April 14th, 1940, to land reinforcements to help the Norwegians. Fighting continued until the British and the French were pressed to a humiliating retreat. And the King of Norway, Haakon VII, took his government into exile in England. He couldn't save the country, but he also would not surrender. So he went into exile, and England accepted him, let him set up a government in exile on June 9th, 1940. It later emerged that the Nazis had been assisted by a traitor from within, a Norwegian who betrayed Norway. His name was Vidkun Quisling, Quisling. For the rest of the war, and for the generation after the war, the term Quisling was synonymous with traitor, like Judas or Benedict Arnold. On May 10th, 1940, while the British were still bogged down fighting in Norway, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was driven out of office. I mean, not by force, but by, he lost the confidence, so the government fell and was replaced. He was replaced as Prime Minister by Winston Churchill to lead a coalition government. On the same day, coincidentally, May 10th, 1940, the Nazis expanded yet again and invaded Belgium and France. The Allies, meaning the French and the British, were prepared to fight another trench war, because that was what the last war was, and they won the last war. So, why change the tactics? However, since the Germans had lost the war, and that last war had been a trench war, in the interwar years they had developed entirely new tactical principles, some of which were proven in Norway and in France in their invasion of Belgium and France. In the Second World War would be, because of the terrain, they were able to implement it more completely than they were in Norway. So this new tactical paradigm developed was called Lightning War, or usually in the histories of the period they'll leave it in the German Blitzkrieg, based on speed and concentration of force through a combination of aerial bombardment, use of paratroopers to drop behind enemy lines to cut communication wires and secure important bridges, so to disrupt the command and control, and also secure logistical routes. Using tanks and mechanized vehicles as distinct units, armored units, instead of just sprinkling the tanks around to support the infantry. High-speed drive to surround and capture key positions rather than attempting to move on a broad line forward all at once. Belgium surrendered on May 27, 1940. France surrendered on June 21, 1940. One weakness of the Blitzkrieg is that it did not include a tight envelopment of positions. This allowed 338,000 British, French, and Belgian troops to be evacuated from the French port of Dunkirk to England and live to fight another day, literally. And that evacuation, the Dunkirk operation, occurred between May 28th and June 4th, 1940. Yet there was no denying that Hitler had achieved in 2 months what the Kaiser's army had failed to achieve in 4 years in the First World War. So in the eyes of Germans, Hitler had vindicated himself and their abdication of their freedoms. They're giving up the Weimar Republic to the Nazis. As we know, in the long run, it didn't work out that way, but in 1940, it seemed to be. On June 23rd, 1940, a brigadier general in the French army named Charles de Gaulle, that's Gaulle, escaped to England, and he declared a free French government. Publicly, he became the propaganda voice for the Free French, for the French who would not accept the conquest of France. And privately, he began organizing the French resistance to the Nazi occupation. In the same month, June 1940, the Germans began air raids against the British Isles, using 2,800 planes against the British, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, which in 1940 had only 650 planes. In the engagement, the Battle of Britain, as it's called, the Royal Air Force attained folk hero status, and Winston Churchill entered the realm of legend. The cost was high. 43,000 British civilians were killed in German raids, and another 51,000 were seriously injured. On August 24th, 1940, the RAF staged an unbelievable, considering the circumstances, an unbelievable raid on Berlin by hovering in a fog bank and then dropping bombs on Berlin. This was the first time in the Second World War that Germans were killed in a combat operation on their own soil. September 3rd, 1940, the American President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom we met in previous videos, made a deal with Churchill called the Lend-Lease Agreement, whereby the Americans would exchange 50 destroyers, naval destroyers, in return for a lease to use British naval and air bases in the Western Hemisphere, in British possessions such as the Bahamas, Bermuda, Newfoundland, Jamaica, probably others I'm not thinking of. This became law when Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act on March 11th, 1941, even though officially the United States was not yet in the war. March 17th, 1941, the Nazis invaded, Yugoslavia, but now that no longer exists, so they invaded the area on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea, which surrendered on April 17th. The leader of the Yugoslav Communist Party was a guy named Josip Broz, B-R-O-Z. He led a resistance movement against the Nazi occupation that made him a hero. He's known to his followers as Tito, and that folk hero status enabled him to become the leader of Yugoslavia after the war. Those of you of a certain age will remember that when we grew up, Yugoslavia was communist, and that was because of this. April 6, 1941, the Nazis invaded Greece after savage fighting. Parts of Greece are mountainous, so the Greeks were able to put up a stiff resistance, as had Poland and Norway and Finland. The Greeks lost 70,000 troops until the government surrendered on April 27th, 1941. Same year, on June 1st, 1941, Pope Pius issued a Pentecost address, which, like the Summi Pontificatus, included teaching, beyond just a general call for peace, which he was doing routinely, but it, contained more developed theological ideas, which are quoted in the Catechism. So, Catechism number 1887, 1887, a teaching on human solidarity. In that section of the address, which is quoted in the Catechism, includes Pius's lament of the inversion of means and end, which resulted in viewing human persons, as a means to an end. Meaning widespread slaughter of innocent people to attain the political objective of advancing Nazi conquest. And that engendered unjust structures which made, and quote, which make Christian conduct in keeping with the commandments of the divine lawgiver difficult and almost impossible. Catechism number 1942. The virtue of solidarity in spreading the spiritual goods of the faith is one, he asserted, that the Church has promoted to guide development of the temporal order, meaning the material universe, which includes economic development, political development, And, we pointed to examples from history where the church had done this. The monastic farmers of the medieval period, the teachers, the monks who preserved literacy and preserved many texts from antiquity that otherwise would have been lost. Many early scientists had actually been monks, like Gregor Mendel, with pioneer of genetics, and also promoting social conditions capable of offering a life, as Pius phrased it, worthy of man, but man capitalized. So we'd say today worthy of human beings and of Christians. Catechism number 2286 also refers to this address in a teaching on the dignity of the person, of the human being, in which he specified that they are guilty of scandal who establish laws or social structures leading to the decline of morals and the corruption of religious practice, or to social conditions that make Christian conduct difficult or impossible because of overt government persecution. All right, June 22nd, 1941. And it wasn't immediately obvious, but we know in retrospect that this day doomed Hitler, because on that day, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, deploying 3 million troops along a 2,000-mile front from Finland in the north to Romania in the south, moving east. Soviet forces at the time still outnumbered them. It consisted of 4 million troops, and as the war proceeded, they would grow. But with following the Blitzkrieg idea, Hitler thought, okay, we'll move in, we'll conquer, we'll knock them out, conquer them within a few months, and just eliminate Soviet communism and just make it occupied territory. Previous Nazi success, coupled with the pitiful showing of the Red Army against Finland, persuaded Hitler that Russia would be conquered in 4 months. 4 months, it's only thunder. By the end of 1941, of that year, the Nazis had killed 1.5 million Soviet troops at a cost of 800,000 of their own. But Stalin would not surrender. This meant that the Nazi armies would have to endure a Russian winter. As I said, it emerged that this was it. This doomed. Thankfully, it doomed Hitler. At the end of that same year, 1941, December 7th, another, in retrospect, turned out to be definitive on the way the World War would end, not just the European. In the modern history playlist, we covered that in Asia, in East Asia, the Second World War actually began in 1936. When Japan invaded Manchuria, then they invaded China, and they had their own agenda. But Japan was allied with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, because Japan was run. Officially it had an emperor, but it was actually the government, the actual government, were militarists, they were fascist, and so this. December 7th, 1941, you all know that's on that day, which was a Sunday, 363 planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, achieving both strategic and tactical surprise in an air raid against the base of the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, which is on Oahu Island in the Hawaiian chains. And earlier in this playlist, covered Damien the Leper, and that's when I talk about the history of Hawaii, how the Americans, got involved in Hawaii. American military dead in the Pearl Harbor attack numbered 3,226, and the United States was in the Second World War. Japan followed this the next day on December 8th, attacked the British on Hong Kong, an island off the coast of China, which they captured by Christmas, by December 25th of 1941. On the same day, December 8th, Japan attacked the British in Malaya, the peninsula, another peninsula that's projects from Asia, and they captured it, the peninsula, by May 18th, 1942. And this included this operation, as they're invading islands in the Pacific. They also invaded the Philippine archipelago, and which had Americans there. And this, which they conquered, this included the infamous 90-mile Bataan Death March in March of 1942, in which 20,000 American and Philippine prisoners of war were marched and died of dehydration and exhaustion. And Japan had attacked the Philippine Islands on December 8th. So those three operate. Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor was December 7th. The next day, December 8th, Japan simultaneously attacked the British in Hong Kong, the British in Malaysia, the Americans in the Philippine archipelago. Then on January 12th, 1942, Japan attacked the British in what was then called Burma, now Myanmar. And they captured it, they conquered it by May of 1942. American Catholics generally supported the war. Reviewing us, okay, we were attacked, so we have to fight. Though there were notable conscientious objectors, such as the Catholic activist Dorothy Day, whom we covered in a previous video, who maintained a pacifist position throughout the conflict. So not just opposing that particular war, but just opposing war in general. In the United States, there were 11,887 officially registered conscientious objectors. Of those, only 135 were Catholic. It's not a large proportion, in a country at the time containing 21 million Catholics. So the last census, that every 10 years. So Pearl Harbor was 1941, but the previous year, 1940, was a census year. So in that census, it showed that the U.S. population was 132 million, and of those, 21 million were Catholics. Which reveals to us that the 19th century Catholic patriotism was still strong. Church leaders supplied much encouragement to church members to support the war effort. Archbishop of Detroit, Edward Mooney, wrote a public letter, a letter to the president, to FDR, but published in the Catholic newspapers, promising that, quote, with a patriotism that is guided and sustained by the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity, the bishops would marshal the spiritual forces at our command to render secure our God-given blessings of freedom. Archbishop Francis Spellman of New York told the troops, quote, in serving your country in a just cause, you are also serving God. Estimates are that Catholics comprised between 25 and 35% of the armed forces of the United States during the war, depending on which year you count. 3,036 Catholic priests served as chaplains in the American Armed Forces. Whereas during the First World War, services to the nation's soldiers were provided by separate groups, such as the YMCA, the Salvation Army, for Protestants, and then for Catholics, the Knights of Columbus and the National Catholic War Council. All of those organizations teamed up during the Second World War in what was known as the United Service Organizations, the USO, which included Catholic service workers, particularly the National Catholic Community Service. In 1941, we got into the war in December 41, and into 42. The U.S. Catholic bishops formed the War, Relief, and Emergency Committee. And the name changed subsequently to the War Relief Services of the National Catholic Welfare Conference, the NCWC, which we covered previously, was founded during the First World War in 1917, which was established to care for refugees, displaced persons, and those impoverished by the war, merchant seamen, and Axis prisoners of war. This organization was later renamed to the Catholic Relief Services, the CRS, which still exist and still carries out the same purposes for today. And in fact, the Conference of Bishops mandates a second collection once a year, that all parishes take up a second collection in support of the Catholic Relief Services, but this is where it started. Okay, in terms of the chaplains, 5 Catholic priests received Medals of Honor in the Second World War. Now, 9 chaplains during the Second World War received the Medal of Honor. Of those 9, 5 were Catholic priests. And the Medal of Honor is the highest, the nation still is, the nation's highest and most prestigious military decoration for valor. Okay, so the first of the 5 Catholic priests. Well, there's no particular order. I'm just, this the first one I'm going to cover. Navy chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Timothy O'Callahan. Well, let me see. Why not? All right. Instead, I'm gonna, because this will take it. So I'm gonna stop here, and so I can name the next video. I'll just have one video only on the chaplains, those 5 priests, and then move on to conclude the Second World War. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.